The first metallic screech, sharper, more violent than the depot's usual mournful symphony of aging machinery, sliced through the pre-dawn hush of the Millburn Transit Depot. It wasn't the accustomed groan of protesting brakes, nor the weary sigh of hydraulics. This was the distinct, unnerving sound of a small, desperately folded paper crane, its meticulously crafted wingtip snagging for a brutal instant on a protruding, rust-flecked screwhead before it skittered a wounded creature across the grimy, worn linoleum of bus number 27. A tiny, almost imperceptible smear of dried blood, like a miniature tragic sunset, stained one delicate, precisely creased wing. Its precarious, hopeful journey was brought to an abrupt, pitiless halt by Frank Grady's heavy scuffed boot. The boy, Ethan, who couldn't have been more than 9, had let it fall. Or perhaps thrown it with a furtive, almost convulsive flick of his thin wrist, a stifled, despairing sob caught in his throat, like a trapped, terrified bird, as a brute of a man, hulking and predatory, who would later introduce himself with a disturbingly broad, almost reptilian smile, as Uncle Raymond had viciously yanked him aboard. The boy's initial frantic attempt to escape Raymond's crushing grasp at the depot entrance. A fleeting, desperate twist of his small body, a wild, panicked flight response, had earned him a sharp, unseen pinch. A cruel vice grip on his upper arm that had drawn that tiny bead of blood later transferred to the paper crane he'd clutched with the ferocity of a drowning man clutching a prayer. Frank had seen the whole exchange. The bloodied paper crane landed near his heel, and as he bent to retrieve it, a shiver cold and deeply familiar traced its icy path down his spine. For a fleeting, sickening moment, the dim depot lights, the smell of stale coffee and exhaust fumes vanished, replaced by the acrid smoke and screaming chaos of a forgotten sun-scorched battlefield. The ghost of a child's terrified whimper echoing in his ears. He'd seen that look before in eyes that had witnessed horrors no child should ever know. He shook the memory off a practiced mental maneuver, but the crane felt heavy in his hand, heavier than mere paper. The boy's eyes, when they'd met Frank's, hadn't just flickered. They'd clung desperate and imploring for a drawn-out, heart-wrenching second, a silent scream for rescue, before Raymond's shadow fell across him. "Mind your manners, Ethan." "And your toys," Raymond had boomed his voice, a jarring metallic clang in the soft, pre-dawn hush, instantly morphing into a cloying, syrupy tone intended for Frank's benefit. "He gets so attached to these little things, our Ethan. A bit of a dreamer, always got his head in the clouds. Takes after his mother, bless her absent-minded heart." His hand, Frank noted with an internal visceral flinch, clamped onto the boy's thin shoulder with the possessive, unyielding grip of a seasoned jailer. Ethan, swallowed by a faded navy jacket, far too large for his frail frame, had stumbled his eyes. Dark, haunted pools in a starkly pale face shimmering with a desperate storm of unshed tears. Darting towards Frank once more, lingering with that heart-stopping plea, before fixing on the scuffed, torn toes of his own worn sneakers. He'd said nothing, not a single word. Just the frantic, silent language of raw, unadulterated terror emanating from him in palpable waves. The fog, soft and cloying, as a freshly woven shroud, clung low along the cracked sidewalk, pressing cool and damp against the depot's grimy, tear-streaked windows. Somewhere beyond the silent, monolithic line of parked buses, silhouetted like slumbering, steel-skinned giants, a solitary crow cawed, a sharp, discordant punctuation mark in the heavy, expectant silence. Inside the depot office, the lingering ghosts of yesterday's acrid coffee and scorched toast hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of the overworked heater's rhythmic percussive hum. The old dust-covered clock on the peeling wall, a forgotten relic from a busier, more prosperous era when Millburn hummed with thriving industry, rather than just the dull, insidious groan of rust and decay, ticked with a lazy, profoundly unreliable gait winning a minute with each passing week. Much like the town itself seemed to be surrendering its vibrancy, its unacknowledged secrets festering beneath a brittle veneer of quiet, unassuming decay. Whispers furtive and hushed still circulated about the old Blackwood Mill, a place many locals insisted was deeply cursed after Old Man Blackwood, its founder, had lost everything in a mysterious fire generations ago. The legend went that he'd made a pact with something dark from the nearby shadowed woods to ensure his fortune, a pact he ultimately broke by trying to cheat his benefactor. And now the mill itself supposedly attracted only misfortune. Ensnaring desperate souls, its stones rumored to weep on moonless nights. It was a place, people said, where hope went to die, and where the Blackwood curse patiently waited to claim its next victim, especially during the shadowed days leading up to the winter solstice. Frank Grady, a man whose weathered face seemed meticulously etched with a roadmap of Milburn's less-traveled, forgotten streets, and the deeper, more sorrowful lines of unspoken haunting memories, rubbed the familiar nagging ache in his left knee, a painful memento from a distant, brutal war he seldom spoke of, even to himself. He stood at the far end of the lot, where the buses huddled in neat, silent rows, their rounded backs fogged with icy dew, their long, cold bodies still slumbering beneath the bruised lavender sky. His hand, calloused and steady, rested on the cold, dew-slicked metal flank of bus number 27. His fingers gnarled, but sure traced the sharp edge of the wing mirror, checking its alignment with the practiced, almost unconscious ease of decades. The glass shivered faintly under his touch, reflecting his own weary, careworn expression and the weight of unspoken observations heavy in his eyes. "Morning, Frank." Lou from maintenance called, his voice muffled by the frigid air and the thick scarf wrapped around his neck, lifting a gloved hand in a lazy, indifferent salute as he trudged past a thick cloud of his own breath preceding him like a weary departing ghost. "Morning, Lou." Frank answered his voice, a low, gravelly rumble, barely disturbing the pre-dawn stillness. He bent again, his movements deliberate, steady, and unhurried, to check the tires. Every morning began this way, a ritual of checks and methodical preparations, a familiar grounding rhythm against the chaos and unpredictability of the world he'd come to expect, a world he'd seen too much of. The same route, the same stops, the same slow rotation of faces, tired, anonymous, and often drawn, stepping on and off his bus without a second glance at the man behind the wheel. Frank didn't mind the quiet. In truth, he preferred it to the forced, empty chatter that often filled the strained spaces between strangers. It allowed him to observe, to notice the things others missed. Later, during his first break, seated in the depot's stale, coffee-scented air, Frank carefully retrieved the blood-smudged paper crane Ethan had dropped. His fingers, surprisingly gentle for their size and calloused texture, unfolded it with a surgeon's care. Inside one delicate wing, a child's shaky, desperate scrawl pressed hard into the paper. "Not uncle. Help. Mom. Hurts." On the other wing, rendered with an almost unnerving, precocious detail, was a tiny drawing of a single, ominous link from a chain. Frank's blood ran cold, a sudden shocking iciness spreading through his veins, the lukewarm coffee in his hand suddenly tasting as bitter as gall. This was not just a moody, difficult child with an overbearing, unpleasant relative. This was something far darker, something insidious, something that resonated with the grim, hushed tales he'd encountered in desolate parts of the world he'd long tried and mostly failed to forget. The chill from the paper seemed to seep into his bones, a stark premonition of unfolding dread. He folded his newspaper, the one he rarely read, until after the midday lull, its headlines of distant, abstract troubles suddenly feeling uncomfortably close, tangible, and slid it into the small, worn compartment beside his seat. He meticulously adjusted the angle of the seatbelt, precisely aligned his few dashboard trinkets. The tiny, stubbornly optimistic compass that always pointed north regardless of Milburn's dreary outlook, a faded, dog-eared photograph of his nephew's boisterous, perpetually grinning golden retriever, Sam, and the small, smooth plastic crucifix his devout mother had pressed into his hand with a whispered prayer just days before she passed. The depot lights flickered once, twice, a hesitant, sputtering signal. Another day already irrevocably, ominously altered had begun. By the time Frank eased the heavy bus out onto Maple Avenue, Milburn was reluctantly, grudgingly stirring. Porch lights blinked like sleepy, uncertain eyes. Curtains twitched with cautious, unseen hands, and the phantom scent of yeast and burnt sugar from McCabe's, the corner bakery that had been a town staple for generations, drifted heavily on the damp, clinging mist. The streets were still, almost deserted, and the air sharp and biting with late autumn's melancholic, fading breath, carrying the faint, damp, earthy scent of fallen leaves. At the first stop near the depressing row of identical duplexes where peeling paint curled like dried, forgotten leaves, he picked up the usuals, Mrs. Callahan wrestling a yarn bag so colossal it perpetually threatened to swallow her whole, already chattering about her latest knitting project for the upcoming, though still distant, winter solstice fair charity drive. And Mr. Reeves, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose as he juggled his smartphone and a lukewarm, steaming coffee cup, already muttering about stocks and council inefficiencies. They offered their tired, rote pleasantries, blissfully, horrifyingly oblivious to the cold, hard stone of dread that had settled heavily in Frank's gut. Cold one this morning, eh? Frank, proper bone chiller. Mrs. Callahan chirped, her needles already clicking with a rapid, hypnotic rhythm yarn unspooling like a colorful serpent from her bag. Hope it warms up for the Solstice Fair Planning Committee tonight. So much to organize. Shame about the Albright family having to pull out of organizing it this year with their troubles and all. The Blackwood curse still got its claws in that property, I tell you. Always is this time of year, Agnes. Frank replied, his voice deliberately soft, carefully steady, a practiced mask of calm normalcy. He watched their reflections in the wide rearview mirror, their faces etched with everyday concerns, and wondered with a sudden chilling clarity how many unspoken terrors, how many hidden cruelties lurked just beneath Milburn's ordinary, deceptively tranquil facades. The bus rocked gently, predictably towards the weathered church steps, where a young mother, her toddler, a bundled vision of pink against her chest, climbed aboard. The child's knitted hat adorned with charmingly stitched animal ears, one already unraveling precariously, bobbed as she offered Frank a brief, fleeting smile. Her eyes, however, dark-rimmed and weary, skating past his without truly connecting. He didn't take it personally. Anonymity was his usual cloak, often a refuge. Today, however, it felt like a crushing, suffocating burden. It was at the fourth stop by the derelict hollow husk of the old Pennyworth department store. Its grimy, shattered windows, like vacant, accusing eyes, staring out at the struggling, listless town, the very stop where the school bus sometimes ran inexplicably late, that the boy, Ethan, and the predatory Raymond reappeared. Ethan, if possible, looked even smaller, more fragile than Frank remembered, from just hours before his movements, stiff, almost puppet-like, as if his strings were being pulled too tightly. The name patch on his school uniform shirt, Ethan, was neatly, almost obsessively stitched, a stark, jarring contrast to the raw, uncontained fear radiating from him like a palpable cold. His head was perpetually, almost painfully bowed eyes, fixed resolutely on the cracked linoleum floor, as if it held profound secrets only he could decipher, or perhaps fearing that meeting a stranger's sympathetic gaze might inflict an unbearable, searing burn. Morning. Frank said, his voice deliberately, even almost gentle, as Ethan fumbled his small hands, trembling violently, for coins by the fare box. The boy managed a minute, jerky nod, his profound silence screaming louder, more desperately than any coherent protest could. The clink of coins dropping into the metallic slot sounded unnaturally loud, almost explosive, in the hushed, palpable expectancy of the bus. "Seats open anywhere you like, son," Frank added, gesturing gently towards the mostly empty rows. Raymond, looming close behind, like a menacing shadow, clapped a heavy proprietary hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture that was far more an assertion of absolute ownership than any semblance of affection. "That's my nephew. Good lad, really. Just a bit sensitive, you know, highly strung. like his dear mother, always a bundle of nerves. Speaking of whom, he continued, his voice now a stage whisper loud enough for several nearby passengers, including Mrs. Callahan and Mr. Reeves, to overhear his mama's taken herself off on a rather extended spiritual retreat with her sister. Finding herself, they call it. Out in the Arizona desert somewhere, no phones allowed, strictly meditative. Apparently the poor dear needs her rest, been under a lot of strain, making some poor choices. Leaves yours truly holding the fort, picking up the pieces, bless her. But what's a devoted, loving uncle to do, eh? Family's family through thick and thin, especially when one of them goes off the rails. Trying to give the boys some stability, a bit of fatherly guidance she, well, hasn't been providing. He offered Frank that chilling, predatory smile, again the one that never ever touched his cold reptilian eyes. He then winked a grotesque, unsettling pantomime of shared masculine understanding that made Frank's skin crawl. Mr. Reeves grunted, seemingly absorbed in his phone. But Frank saw his eyes flick towards Raymond with a brief, unreadable expression. Ethan drifted, almost floated to the back of the bus, shoulders hunched visibly, trying to shrink to disappear into the faded, worn upholstery. At the next stop, two older boys, local terrors known for their casual cruelty, clambered on their boisterous, unthinking laughter, echoing unpleasantly. One jabbed a thumb dismissively towards Ethan, a silent, cruel mockery, but neither spoke to him. Ethan didn't seem to register their presence. His pale face pressed hard against the fogged window, a thin finger tracing invisible patterns on the cold glass. Letters, Frank thought with a jolt, or perhaps chillingly, the outline of that single damning chain link from the crane. The ephemeral marks vanished as quickly as they were made, absorbed by the condensation. Morning. Mr. Grady called old Hank Pritchard, a retired history teacher with a penchant for grim, often accurate pronouncements and an almost encyclopedic, albeit somewhat morbid knowledge of Milburn's less savory, conveniently forgotten past, as he disembarked at his usual stop near the library. He sometimes spoke of the Blackwood Mill's misfortunes with a peculiar glint in his eye. How it always seemed to attract shadows and sorrow, and its legendary curse whispered to drag down anyone connected to its soiled legacy, a cycle of despair particularly potent around the dark of the year near the solstice. "Take care," Frank replied, his eyes flicking to the man in the mirror. Hank's gaze, surprisingly sharp, swept the bus, lingering for a moment too long on Ethan and the hovering Raymond before he shook his head, almost imperceptibly, a troubled frown creasing his lips. Each stop felt like a metronome beat, inexorably ticking down passengers embarking and disembarking in their predictable dance. But the small, silent boy at the back remained a fixed, throbbing point of profound, escalating unease. When they reached the sprawling, unkempt grounds of Milburn Elementary, a noisy, chaotic tide of children spilled out from various waiting cars and homes. Ethan was the last to rise from his seat, the last to step off the bus, his movements hesitant, leaden, almost fearful. Frank watched the teachers stationed at the gate. One Miss Albright, a woman whose family had once owned the now derelict Blackwood Mill on the remote outskirts of town. A fact Hank often lamented as a prime example of the Blackwood curse striking down even its inheritors, especially with whispers of renewed financial woes plaguing her. Was known for her occasionally sharp tongue but fundamentally underlying kindness. Today, however, she seemed unusually distracted, almost visibly harried, her face pale, and drawn dark circles stark beneath her eyes. She offered a generic, strained smile to the chattering incoming groups. But when Ethan passed her, her gaze slid away with an unnatural quickness, her expression unreadable almost, avoidant, even fearful. A slight, uncontrollable tremor ran through her hand as she fussily adjusted her scarf against a non-existent chill. No welcoming greeting, no small personal kindness that Frank had sometimes seen her offer other solitary, seemingly lost children. Ethan didn't look back. Didn't look at anyone, simply melted into the throng, vanishing like a wisp of smoke into the school's indifferent maw. Frank sat, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white, the chill of the blood-smudged paper crane seeping from his pocket into the clammy palm of his hand. He wasn't prone to flights of imaginative fancy. His wartime experiences had brutally efficiently stripped him of most illusions about human nature. But the boy's silent, profound terror was a leaden, suffocating weight in his chest. He turned the key, the engine's familiar, reassuring hum, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him, and pulled back onto the road, the empty seats creaking behind him like old arthritic bones. The air in the bus now carried not just the familiar scents of machine oil, wet pavement, and stale upholstery, but the faintest, undeniably metallic, cloying scent of fear. Near the depot gates as he completed his morning run, the same solitary crow cawed, sharper this time, more insistent. A discordant, mocking note against the town's slowly awakening hum. Window blinds were snapping open with sharp, sudden reports, porch lights winking out one by one. McCabe's bakery was raising its heavy steel shutters with a prolonged metallic screech that on any other ordinary day would have been familiar, almost comforting. Frank leaned heavily on the steering wheel, the crumpled, damning paper crane a burning, unbearable secret in his pocket. Routine made things easy, predictable. Routine was a shield, but routine had just been irrevocably shattered by a single piece of folded paper, a smear of blood, and a child's terrified, pleading eyes. The next day, the dreadful pattern held a twisted, nightmarish parody of normalcy. At the third stop, the boisterous, oblivious older boys. At the fourth, Ethan, a specter of misery, followed closely by Raymond, whose very presence seemed to suck the air. The light from the bus replacing it with a cloying, insidious false sweetness that Frank found increasingly repulsive. "Morning, Frank, old friend," old pal Raymond called, his voice excessively loud, gratingly cheerful, tossing the exact fare into the box with a careless, almost contemptuous disdain. "Kids with me again, naturally. His dear mum still on that spiritual retreat with her sister out west. Finding herself communing with the coyotes, you know the type. Meditating so hard she forgot her own son, apparently. Poor dear needs her rest completely run down, probably from all the partying. Leaves me holding the fort, the responsible one, as always trying to instill some discipline. But what's a devoted, put-upon uncle to do, eh?" He shot a disingenuous, performative glance at the other passengers, a low-rent actor seeking an audience for his supposed selfless magnanimity. One or two elderly women offered him sympathetic, clueless smiles, tutting about modern mothers. Frank's eyes, however, met Ethan's for a fleeting, desperate, soul-searing second before the boy's gaze dropped like a stone, fear eclipsing everything, his small face a mask of anguished resignation. "Go on, Ethan. Find a seat out of the way." Raymond ordered, a subtle but firm, almost painful push, propelling the boy towards the back. Ethan slid into his usual desolate corner, his shoulders already curving inward, a flower wilting under a harsh, unyielding frost. Raymond took his place one row directly behind him, leaning forward conspiratorially, a predator, meticulously observing its captive prey. Frank's eyes, hard and unwavering, found the mirror catching the flicker of pure, unadulterated malice that danced in Raymond's eyes when he thought no one was looking. "We had a good long talk last night, didn't we, sport?" Raymond's voice, though deliberately low, was laced with a chilling, unmistakable menace sharp enough to cut through the monotonous drone of the engine. "About listening. About, well, about appreciating what you've got. About consequences when you don't. About how some things are best kept in the family. Some lessons are learned the hard way, aren't they?" Ethan flinched, a barely perceptible tremor running through his small frame. But Frank saw it. Frank saw everything. He kept his eyes resolutely on the road, but his knuckles were bone white on the wheel. 1, 2, 3 deep, steadying breaths. "You don't jump at shadows, Grady. Not yet. You watch. You listen. You wait. You gather. But the waiting was becoming an agony. Old Hank Pritchard boarded with his usual scowl and a rustle of his morning paper. "Mornin', Frank. Another day, another dollar, eh? Heard the Solstice Fair's budget committee is in an uproar. Always something in this town." "Mornin'." Hank Frank replied, his voice carefully neutral. Hank's keen gaze, as always, swept the bus, lingering significantly on Ethan and the ever-present Raymond. He shook his head faintly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, muttering just loud enough for Frank to hear over the low rumble of the engine and the chatter of other passengers. "That boy. He ain't been right for weeks now. Looks like a trapped bird, a poor little sparrow in a hawk's talons. Some folks, they just cast long, dark shadows, Frank. Long, cold shadows. Sometimes even on those who try to help them, not knowing what they're getting into." His eyes held a strange, conflicted sorrow. Frank heard. The words, heavy with unspoken meaning, amplified his own burgeoning dread, coiling it tighter in his chest. The usual soft chatter of the older women, Mrs. Callahan, detailing the complexities of a cable-knit pattern for a Solstice Fair prize, Hank's pen scratching determinedly at his crossword puzzle. The college girl lost in her headphones, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. It all felt like a fragile paper-thin veneer over something rotten, festering and rapidly decaying just beneath the surface of Milburn's placid existence. At the back of the bus, the air was thick, heavy, a silent, suffocating warning. Raymond's voice, a venomous, insidious whisper, drifted forward, slithering like a snake. "You keep your mouth shut tight, got it? One wrong word, one look to the wrong person. You know what happens. People get disappointed. And when I get disappointed, things get unpleasant. For everyone. Especially for those we care about, right?" Ethan stared out at the fogged, indifferent window, his small hands clenching and unclenching the worn straps of his backpack, as if trying to physically ground himself against the tide of fear threatening to pull him under. At the school, as the usual chaotic torrent of children scrambled off, Ethan was again the very last. Raymond stood first, a looming, menacing shadow eclipsing the boy. Frank watched in the mirror as Raymond's heavy hand pressed hard, cruelly against the small of Ethan's back, steering him with firm, undeniable control. Miss Albright was at the gate, her smile even more strained, more artificial today, tying a younger child's errant shoelace with a practiced, almost purely mechanical motion, her eyes distant. When Ethan passed, her face remained oddly, disturbingly blank. No recognition, no flicker of concern. Just a swift, almost panicked, averted gaze. Raymond lingered pointedly by the fence, eyes narrowed into slits, watching Ethan disappear into the school building before turning his gaze slowly, deliberately to the bus, to Frank, a look that was both a brazen challenge and unnervingly, chillingly confident. Then, with a self-satisfied smirk, he strolled away, whistling a tuneless, jaunty little ditty that grated on Frank's already frayed nerves. Frank's jaw clenched so hard it ached. The mirror showed only empty seats, rows of faded green vinyl, yet the oppressive chill lingered, a miasma of fear. He took a long, scalding sip of coffee from his thermos. Some things he knew from bitter experience required infinite patience, but his gut, honed by years of observing the darkest sides of human nature, experiences he preferred to keep deeply buried, screamed at him that this situation wouldn't fix itself. This was a cancer, insidious and aggressive, spreading unchecked in the quiet, forgotten, shadowy corners of their unsuspecting town. Raymond was a sickness, and Ethan was its most vulnerable victim. He glanced at the news about an upcoming town meeting to discuss the winter solstice fair, meant to be a beacon of community spirit, and the irony was a bitter pill. The following morning, after a near sleepless night, replaying Ethan's haunted, pleading face, and the stark, desperate message on the paper crane. Its image burned into his retina. Frank watched with a sickening lurch in his stomach as Ethan stumbled heavily on the bus steps. A tiny, almost inaudible whimper of pain escaped him, as his knee buckled, his small hand instinctively protectively going to his ankle. Raymond, right behind him, like a jailer, hissed loud enough for Frank to overhear clumsy little oath. "Watch yourself, or you'll be sorry." He then plastered on that grotesque broad smile for Frank's benefit. "Growing pains, you know how it is, Frank. Sprouting up like a weed, this one. Always tripping over his own feet." As Ethan moved slowly, painfully down the aisle, his too large jacket hitched up slightly as he maneuvered into his seat. Frank saw it, just for a fleeting, horrifying second, catching the dull, greasy light from the overhead lamps. A thin, dull glint of raw, cheap metal against the boy's pathetically thin, bruised ankle, disappearing almost instantly under the frayed, dirty hem of his jeans. A chain. Small, yes, horribly, terrifyingly slender, but undeniably a chain fastened with a tiny, cheap, cruelly efficient padlock. It was like a physical blow to Frank's chest, knocking the air from his lungs. "What the words choked, unformed in his throat. His foot, acting on pure, visceral, unthinking reaction, slammed down hard on the brake pedal. Tires shrieked hideously on the damp, unforgiving asphalt. The bus lurched violently, throwing unsuspecting passengers forward with bruising force. Mrs. Callahan gasped sharply, her colossal yarn bag spewing its colorful, tangled guts across the aisle like startled, grotesque entrails. Hank Pritchard's newspaper flew from his grasp, his glasses knocked askew, and he let out an indignant yelp, steadying himself on a pole. Mr. Reeves yelped as hot coffee splashed his hand, swearing under his breath. What in God's name was that Grady Raymond's voice, sharp as a shard of glass, suspicious and laced with sudden alarm, cut through the surprised exclamations, startled cries, and nervous, frightened murmurs of the other passengers? Frank fought desperately for composure, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped, frantic thing. He forced his voice into a semblance of evenness, blandness. "Dog. Stray. Ran right out in front of me." He gestured vaguely, unconvincingly ahead, at the empty, rain-slicked street. Came out of nowhere, out of damn thing. Raymond's eyes narrowed, sharp, cold, and intensely assessing, boring into Frank's, searching for any flicker of deception. After a torturous, silent pause that stretched for an eternity, heavy with unspoken accusation, he muttered, his voice tight with suspicion. "Damn strays. Ought to round 'em all up and put 'em down. Menace to society." He leaned back in his seat, but the palpable tension remained, a live, crackling wire stretching between them, the feigned, oily bonhomie now entirely, irrevocably gone. He spent the rest of the journey subtly watching Frank in the reflection of the window. Just then, Raymond's cheap burner phone buzzed insistently. He snatched it up, hissing, "Yeah, into it." Frank, while appearing to focus on apologizing to passengers and writing Mrs. Callahan's yarn, strained his ears. Raymond's voice was low, urgent. "Look, the merchandise is secure. Yeah, the consignment, as you call it. But the buyers are getting jumpy. They want it moved up. Fast. Before the solstice. Yeah, the damn town fair makes for good cover. Lots of out-of-towners, perfect chaos. Miller Place is prepped and waiting. Don't rush me. It'll be done, and I expect full payment on delivery, no funny business, or the deal's off. You tell your people that." He snapped the phone shut, a grim, almost feral satisfaction briefly illuminating his face before the suspicious, watchful mask returned. The other passengers, deeply unsettled by the sudden stop, and the lingering tension, began to murmur amongst themselves, casting anxious, uneasy glances towards both Frank and Raymond. Frank ignored them, his training kicking in. His gaze in the mirror locked onto Ethan. The boy had lifted his head, his small face ashen gray with terror. Just for a second their eyes met, red-rimmed, filled with a universe of raw terror, shame, and a desperate flickering ember of hope that Frank felt he had almost brutally extinguished with his uncontrolled outburst. Frank's hands, slick with cold sweat, steadied on the wheel. He eased the bus back into motion, and the engine's familiar rumble, a fragile, insufficient shield. Something inside him, something long dormant, hardened and tempered by old forgotten battles, cracked open raw and fiercely undeniably protective. He wasn't just an observer anymore. The rain had begun before the morning bell, a soft, insidious weeping against the classroom windows, intensifying as the day wore on, mirroring the cold, pervasive dread that had settled over Ethan like a suffocating blanket. He sat in the second row from the back, the neatly stitched name patch on his shirt seeming to droop with his spirits, a visible marker of his misery. His pencil, slick with sweat from his palm, rolled from his nerveless fingers, coming to rest near a math worksheet he couldn't possibly decipher through the distorting blur in his eyes. Whispers, sharp, insidious, and unbelievably cruel, slithered like venomous snakes from the desks around him. Look at him. Gonna cry again? Weirdo. Bet he still wets the bed. He clutched a folded piece of paper hidden in his lap, a shaky, poignant sketch of his mother's kind, gentle face, her dark, wavy hair in a loose, comfortable braid, the way she always wore it when she was happy baking cookies or reading him stories. The pencil lines were smudged where his damp, trembling palm had pressed against them. Ethan. The teacher, Mr. Davies, a young, clearly inexperienced man, visibly overwhelmed by a too large class and a too small salary, sounded exasperated, his patience worn dangerously thin, stretched taut like an overtuned guitar string. Question 5. The answer, please. Are you rejoining us from whatever distant planet you're currently visiting? Or are you perhaps too busy with your artwork again? A ripple of cruel, barely suppressed laughter spread through the room like a contagion. Ethan quickly tucked the precious sketch into his workbook, his face burning with a hot, searing shame and the bitter sting of unshed tears. He wished the floor would open up and swallow him. When the bell shrieked its cacophonous release, he was deliberately slow to gather his things, his movements leaden, heavy with despair. Outside, the rain was a relentless driving torrent, turning the schoolyard into a muddy morass. Raymond waited, a dark, ominous silhouette, leaning with feigned casualness against the school's old moss-covered stone fence, a modern-day gargoyle leering in the downpour. His eyes, cold, calculating, and possessive, were fixed intently on Ethan. "Come on," Raymond's voice, low, flat, and devoid of any warmth, carried an unmistakable, chilling threat. "We're not dawdling today. Got places to be, important arrangements to finalize before this town gets too festive for its own good." Ethan followed a tiny, silent prisoner, trotting obediently at his captor's heel. The bus ride home was a silent, agonizing torment. Raymond's phone buzzed again several times. As he checked it, muttering under his breath about finalizing the damn arrangements, the Miller Place contact, getting antsy about the solstice deadline, and something truly chilling about prepayment for the asset arriving tomorrow. Ethan, with a movement so slight, so practiced, so desperate that Frank almost missed it in the rearview mirror, let his hand slip beneath his seat. A small, folded, grimy note dropped perfectly wedged under the cold metal lip of the seat frame, just as Frank had subtly, almost imperceptibly indicated earlier that morning. By scratching his own ear, twice a silent, desperate signal developed between them over those harrowing, fear-filled days. On the note, in addition to the previous pleas, Ethan had managed to scrawl a shaky, "He hurts her. Hurry." Ethan even managed the faintest, almost invisible dip of his head. At the depot that evening, long after the last bus had shuddered to a halt and the lights were dimmed, Frank, methodically sweeping up the day's debris, found it. Rough, jagged letters scrawled in desperate haste, smudged by dirt and unmistakable fear. "Help. Not uncle. Mom locked up. Old Blackwood Mill. He says he will sell her soon. To bad men. He hurts her. Hurry, plus I trust you. The Blackwood Mill. Ms. Albright's family's cursed place." The legend of Old Man Blackwood's broken pact, and the mill's insatiable hunger for lost souls, especially as the solstice neared, echoed in his mind. The pieces clicked sickeningly, horrifyingly into place. Sell her. The casual, brutal cruelty of those two words scrawled by a terrified child hit Frank with the force of a physical blow, far harder than Raymond's shrieking brakes. Frank's hands crushed the soiled paper, his knuckles white. Patience, Grady. One mistake. But the clock was ticking louder now, deafeningly. The next morning, rain still drumming a mournful, relentless rhythm on his cheap apartment roof, Frank called in sick, his voice convincingly hoarse. He parked his old, unassuming, battered green truck across from the school a block away, blending in almost invisibly with the other parked vehicles of parents dropping off their children. He saw Raymond's equally battered blue sedan screech to a halt at the curb. He saw Ethan slide out, saw the boy flinch almost violently as Raymond's hand shot out. Not touching, not this time, but an invisible leash, a clear, unmistakable threat in the brutal tightening of his jaw and the cold fury in his eyes. At lunchtime, Frank Cap pulled low over his eyes, wiping non-existent grease from his hands with a dirty rag, to complete his disguise as a parent helping with a school construction project, casually entered the school's less-used side entrance. My daughter, Clarissa Clay, grade 3, he mumbled to the bored, uninterested security guard, naming his niece whose picture was in his wallet. She's sick. Called from the nurse's office to pick her up early. A weary, indifferent nod, a cursory, uninterested glance at a long dog-eared list, and he was in. He found Ethan huddled by the rain-swept, deserted courtyard, alone with an untouched, forlorn-looking sandwich beside him, sheltering miserably under a small, dripping awning. Frank sat on a nearby cold, damp bench, placing his own wrapped turkey on wheat sandwich carefully between them. "Don't have to eat it if you don't want to." Frank said, his voice low, calm, incredibly gentle. "Just figured you might have missed breakfast again, son." Minutes stretched long and taut, filled only by the persistent, monotonous drumming of the rain on the corrugated iron roof of the awning. "Found your note, Ethan. The one you left yesterday. About the old Blackwood mill. About your mom and what he plans to do. About selling her." Ethan froze, his small body instantly rigid taut, with a fresh wave of suffocating fear. His eyes widened, pupils dilating into black pools. "I believe you, kid. Every single word." Frank's voice was gravelly, imbued with a deep sincerity. "You're not making this up. I know you're not." Slowly, hesitantly, Ethan turned, his haunted eyes shadowed with deep purple crescents of exhaustion and stark terror meeting Frank's. I don't know what to do," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the insistent rain, raw and broken. "He checks me. The chain. Every night. He said if it's ever loose, I can't. You don't have to do anything more, Ethan. Not a single thing more. You've done enough. You just need to trust me now. Your mom. Raymond took her to the old mill, that's what you said in the note." Ethan nodded, fresh hot tears welling, spilling silently onto his pale, dirt-streaked cheeks. He said, "She was bad to him, always lied about things, about money. That he's keeping her safe there, protecting her from herself. But he won't let me talk to her, not even for a minute. He told me, if I ever tell anyone at all, he'll hurt her much worse. Or me." His voice cracked, dissolving into a choked sob. "The chain. He said it's so I can't run away when he's making his final arrangements for her. For us." Frank's heart constricted with a vicarious agony. The methodical, calculated cruelty was staggering, almost beyond comprehension. "You've been incredibly brave, Ethan. More brave than anyone, especially a boy your age, should ever have to be. But listen to me carefully. From this moment on, you're not alone in this anymore. I'm gonna help. We're gonna get your mom back. But you have to be strong for a little longer. You gotta stay calm, act normal. Pretend nothing's wrong, just like you've been doing so bravely. No fighting him, no crying where he can see or hear. You wait for my signal on the bus tomorrow morning. Okay, can you do that for me? For your mom, Ethan, clutching the offered uneaten sandwich like a precious talisman, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something other than pure fear. Now kindling in his desolate eyes, nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Frank's steady, compassionate face. You won't let him win, he whispered so faintly, Frank almost missed it. Promise me. Please. Save her. I promise, Ethan. I promise. Frank made his way directly to the Millburn police station, a squat two-story brick building squeezed unceremoniously between the brightly lit hardware store and the slumbering silent firehouse. He laid Ethan's desperate smudged notes, including the tragically bloodied paper crane, carefully before Sergeant Miller Wallace, a wiry, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, with eyes that missed absolutely nothing and a hard-earned reputation for methodical, relentless persistence. The old Blackwood Mill. Frank stated his voice flat, carefully devoid of emotion, betraying none of the white-hot rage simmering just beneath his calm surface. He's holding Bella Morales there. Ethan, her son, says he's planning on selling her. The man's name is Raymond Deacon. Ethan also mentioned Deacon taking calls on a burner phone about finalizing arrangements and prepayment for the asset and a solstice deadline. And there's a teacher at the school, Miss Albright. Her family owned the mill. She's been acting strangely around Ethan, averted eyes, almost scared herself. She seems involved somehow. Maybe unwillingly, but involved. He then added, there's also Hank Pritchard, the retired teacher. He's made some odd comments. Might be worth a quiet look. And Mr. Reeves, the businessman who rides early. He seemed unusually interested in Raymond's lies about Bella, but I might be imagining that. Wallace listened intently, her expression unreadable. Her pen scratching methodically, efficiently across her notepad, her gaze sharp and focused on Frank. The chain on the boy, you're certain? As sure as I'm sitting here, Sergeant. Saw it with my own eyes this morning. A thin metal chain padlocked to his ankle. Bella Morales, reported missing 3 weeks ago. Vanished without a trace after her late shift at the diner down on Route 9. We've had feelers out on Raymond Deacon for a while. He has a significant history with her, a minor local record for stalking harassment, couple of restraining orders she took out that expired. Classic obsessive type. His name came up immediately when she went missing, but we had no solid leads, nothing to hold him on. This selling angle, this asset talk, unfortunately fits some darker whispers, some intelligence we've been gathering about Deacon's potential associates from out of state. Human traffickers. Dangerous people. The Albright connection. That's new and deeply troubling. The Blackwood Mill has been derelict, condemned even for decades. If Miss Albright is involved willingly or unwillingly, she might be talking about debts and mistakes because she is compromised. Wallace frowned. We start immediate covert surveillance. 24/7. On Deacon, on the mill, on Albright. And we'll put a quiet tail on Pritchard and Reeves, see if anything shakes loose. When we have Bella's exact location within that godforsaken mill confirmed and Deacon's established pattern, we move. Fast, quiet, and hard. You, Frank, you keep driving that bus. Keep everything normal as breathing. The boy needs to see that constant, that anchor needs to know the plan is in motion without Deacon suspecting a damn thing. Any deviation could spook him, and he could hurt them both. I'll need a clear signal for the boy. When it's happening. So he knows what to expect, when to be ready. Frank tapped the dashboard of his mental bus, visualizing the scene. 2 quick, distinct taps on the dash. If I then scratch my chin right after, it means your team is close, ready to move. That it's happening for real, no turning back." Wallace nodded, her eyes approving. Simple, clean, unmistakable. "Keep him calm, Frank. That's paramount. Deacon sounds volatile, unpredictable. One wrong move." "He's done all the hard work," Sergeant Frank said quietly, his mind filled with the image of the boy's small, desperate courage, the bloodied crane, the notes. "Ethan just needs us to finish it." The next afternoon, the bus groaned and hissed into its familiar monotonous rhythm. Ethan boarded looking even paler than usual, followed by Raymond, whose feigned bonhomie, his forced jocularity, felt particularly jarring, almost obscene against the grim backdrop of Frank's chilling knowledge and the silent unfolding plan. Near Maple and 6th, as the bus idled impatiently at a long stoplight, Frank's hand casually, seemingly absently, tapped the dashboard twice, 2 quick, sharp raps. In the mirror, Ethan's head lifted infinitesimally, his eyes flicking to Frank's reflection. At the next stop, as old Mrs. Henderson fumbled noisily for her change, dropping a cascade of coins, Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully, as if pondering some mundane problem. Ethan's gaze met his. Scared, yes, profoundly scared, but also undeniably resolute. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod of understanding passed between them. The trap, carefully baited, was laid. The players were in position. Mr. Reeves, boarded at his usual stop, gave a curt nod and buried his face in his financial paper, but not before his eyes lingered on Raymond for a beat too long. The morning of the operation broke gray-heavy and oppressive, the air thick with unshed rain and a palpable, suffocating tension. Frank felt it, a low, insistent thrumming in his veins, an old familiar battle instinct awakening from its long slumber. The bus filled with its usual diverse load of weary, half-asleep commuters and chattering, boisterous students, all blissfully unaware of the high-stakes drama about to unfold. At the 4th stop, Raymond's battered blue sedan screeched to a halt beside the curb with uncharacteristic haste. He practically shoved Ethan onto the bus, his eyes darting around nervously, suspiciously, a new dangerous layer of agitated, volatile energy radiating from him. "Morning." Frank Raymond's voice was too loud, too forced. His smile stretched taut as a drumskin across his predatory face. He gripped Ethan's arm tightly, his thick fingers digging painfully into the boy's thin bicep, leaving angry red marks. As they sat, Raymond in his usual spot directly behind Ethan, a vulture hovering over its prey. Frank saw him lean close, his mouth moving rapidly, venomously by Ethan's ear. He couldn't hear the exact words, but Ethan flinched violently, almost convulsively, his small face paling further, if that were even possible, turning a sickly grayish hue. Frank's hands tightened on the wheel until his knuckles ached. At 5th and Jefferson, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the first unmarked sedan, Sergeant Wallace's plainclothes team, blending in seamlessly with the sparse morning traffic. He also saw Ms. Albright, the teacher, walking briskly, almost furtively away from the bus stop, having just concluded a brief, hushed, and clearly tense, agitated conversation with Raymond moments before he'd boarded the bus with Ethan. Her face was ashen, her shoulders hunched defensively. Accomplice or coerced, terrified victim. The ambiguity, the uncertainty was deeply unsettling. Frank prayed it was the latter. At a long, frustrating red light near the town square, surrounded by the festive, yet-to-be-lit decorations for the upcoming winter solstice fair, Raymond suddenly tensed, his whole body going rigid. He'd spotted one of the unmarked cars further back in traffic. Or perhaps it was something Mr. Reeves, seated near the front, did, a subtle hand gesture or a shift in his seat that Raymond caught in the mirror. His eyes, preternaturally sharp and deeply paranoid, picked up on the subtle, almost imperceptible cues. His head whipped around, his gaze sweeping the street behind them. He muttered something foul under his breath, a low, vicious curse. Change of plans, it seems. Looks like we're taking an early detour. Mr. Reeves suddenly coughed a dry, hacking sound, and shifted uncomfortably. Frank's heart leaped into his throat. It was happening too soon, going off script. This wasn't the designated takedown spot. He instinctively gave the 2 sharp taps on the dashboard, scratched his chin deliberately. Now. It has to be now. He prayed Wallace's team was ready for an audible. The bus hissed to a stop at the next corner, not the prearranged derelict warehouse district, but a busy intersection near a crowded strip mall. Plainclothes officers were already subtly moving, attempting to blend with the sparse early morning pedestrian traffic. But Raymond was now fully alert, coiled like a cornered viper. Sensing the closing net, Raymond yanked Ethan from his seat with brutal, terrifying force. "We're getting off here, driver. Sudden change of scenery for me and the dear nephew. Don't try anything stupid." He was pulling something from his jacket pocket. Small, metallic, wickedly sharp. A crudely fashioned shiv, the sharpened handle of a stolen spoon, its jagged edge glinting menacingly in the dim interior light of the bus. Passengers gasped and cried out in alarm, shrinking back in terror, a wave of panic rippling through the confined space. Mrs. Callahan shrieked. "Nobody move!" Raymond snarled, his eyes wild, flicking between Frank and the closing officers visible through the front windows. He grabbed Ethan, pulling the boy flush against his body, the point of the shiv now pressed firmly, chillingly against the soft, vulnerable skin of Ethan's throat. "One wrong move, and the kid gets it. I mean it. You back off, cops. I want a car and safe passage out of this damn town." Before Raymond could solidify his horrifying threat, 2 officers materializing, as if from the fog-laden morning air itself, boarded swiftly through the front and middle doors simultaneously. Raymond Deacon, Milburn Police. "Drop the weapon, it's over." Raymond swore viciously, a stream of invective. He shoved Ethan violently towards Frank in the front of the bus, using the terrified boy as a momentary desperate shield, still keeping the shiv dangerously close to his neck. "Stay back, I swear to God I'll gut him," he screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and fear, his eyes wild, darting, seeking an escape. He lunged desperately for the rear emergency exit. Suddenly, a commotion from the middle of the bus. Not Hank this time, but Mr. Reeves. The businessman was on his feet, his face a mask of panic. "Don't shoot, he has information. I was just passing messages for money. He said it was just financial documents." He babbled, trying to edge away from the officers, his eyes wide with terror. One of the officers near the middle door quickly and efficiently subdued him. Raymond, seeing his escape routes cut off and any potential leverage through Reeves evaporate, roared in frustration. He capitalized on the momentary chaos caused by Reeves's outburst. He scrambled wild-eyed and snarling toward the front of the bus, shiv raised high, aiming directly for Frank, perhaps seeing him correctly as the orchestrator of his downfall. You did this, you meddling bastard. You're all dead." An elderly passenger near the front screamed and tried to scramble away, falling and hitting her head on a seat support, letting out a cry of pain. Frank was already out of his seat, adrenaline surging, old instincts buried deep by decades of monotonous civilian life, flaring to vibrant, violent life. His bad knee screamed in agonizing protest, but he ignored it, the pain, a distant, irrelevant distraction. Raymond came at him, a cornered animal shiv flashing, aiming for Frank's face. Frank sidestepped, a smooth, economical move from a half-forgotten, brutal training drill, learned in a place far hotter and more dangerous than Milburn. As Raymond overreached, Frank brought his heavy-duty stainless steel thermos, still half full of scalding coffee, down hard with devastating force on Raymond's extended wrist. There was a sickening, audible crack of bone. The shiv clattered harmlessly to the linoleum floor. Raymond howled, a ghastly, high-pitched sound of pure agony and frustrated, impotent rage clutching his shattered, dangling arm. "It's over." Deacon Frank's voice was a serrated, unforgiving edge cutting through the pandemonium and the terrified whimpers of the passengers. Officers swarmed Raymond, subduing him quickly, cuffs clicking shut. The female officer, after securing Reeves, moved to check on the injured passenger, while another tended to Hank, who was now sobbing quietly in his seat. His earlier attempt to warn Raymond foiled by the rapid police action, his complicity clear from his terror. Ethan, pale as death and trembling uncontrollably from head to toe, his small body shaking with violent, racking sobs, launched himself at Frank, burying his tear-streaked face in the worn, familiar fabric of his transit jacket, clinging to him with desperate strength. The sounds he made were raw, heartbreaking, the release of unimaginable terror. "It's over, kid," Frank murmured, his hand surprisingly gentle, stroking the boy's sweat-damp, matted hair. "You're safe. You're safe now. It's all over." Simultaneously across town, at the long-abandoned, reputedly cursed Blackwood Mill, whose dark legend now seemed chillingly apt, another heavily armed tactical team breached a heavily reinforced cellar door, cleverly concealed beneath a pile of rotten tarpaulins and discarded refuse. They found Bella Morales chained by her ankle with a heavy rusted logging chain to a thick iron support beam in a damp, lightless stone cell. She was heartbreakingly weak, severely dehydrated, and utterly terrified, but miraculously alive. Ms. Albright was there too, huddled in a dark corner, weeping hysterically, almost incoherent with fear and guilt. She confessed immediately, her words tumbling out in a torrent, babbling about how Raymond had cunningly approached her weeks ago, preying on her known desperation. Her family, she explained, was on the very brink of losing the historic Blackwood Mill entirely, to crippling back taxes and insurmountable debt, the final tragic chapter of the Blackwood curse. Raymond, somehow privy to this private financial ruin, had offered her a substantial sum of untraceable cash, no questions asked, for the discreet use of the mill's supposedly secure forgotten cellars, vaguely menacingly hinting it was for storing valuable, if slightly illicit, antique goods. Desperate to save her family legacy, burdened by the weight of the mill's dark history and her own perceived failures, she'd foolishly agreed, deliberately turning a blind eye, only slowly, horrifyingly realizing the unspeakable truth of who, not what, Raymond was actually storing. He'd then brutally threatened her family, her children, when she'd tried to back out, coercing her continued silence and minimal reluctant assistance with food and water for Bella. It was Miss Albright, her crushing guilt finally overwhelming her paralyzing fear after seeing Deacon's increasing agitation and violent paranoia that morning, who had made a desperate, anonymous, frantic call to a police tip line about deeply suspicious activity at the mill just an hour before the dramatic bus incident, a crucial last-minute piece of information that significantly accelerated Sergeant Wallace's carefully laid plan. Hours later, in the sterile, hushed quiet of Milburn General Hospital, Ethan sat beside Bella's narrow hospital bed, her face, though terribly bruised, gaunt, and deeply etched with the profound suffering of her ordeal, lit up with an incandescent, almost holy joy when she finally saw him, her beloved son. Their reunion was a raw, silent, profoundly moving symphony of overflowing tears, whispered, choked assurances, and desperately clutched hands, a sacred bond, brutally tested, now being tenderly reforged in the immediate fragile aftermath of unimaginable terror. Frank watched from the doorway for a long moment, a lump the size of a large fist lodged stubbornly in his throat, then quietly, unobtrusively retreated, leaving them to their precious, fragile, hard-won peace. Sergeant Wallace found him slumped wearily in a plastic chair in the brightly lit corridor, her usually stern, impassive face softened with a tired, genuine respect. Deacon singing like a canary, Frank, already trying to cut a deal implicating his out-of-state contacts. Seems he had firm plans to move Bella tonight, at the latest sell her to some very dark, dangerous elements he knew from his prison days. Said she owed him for leaving him for Ethan's father years ago, claimed this was his twisted way of collecting what he felt was his due. Classic sociopath. Human trafficking pure and simple with a nasty revenge motive thrown in. Your boy's note about Raymond selling her wasn't just childhood fear, Frank. It was cold, hard fact. We cut it damn close, closer than I like. Ms. Albright's cooperating fully. Looks like a clear case of coercion and extreme duress, coupled with some truly terrible initial judgment on her part. She'll face charges, of course, but her testimony and that crucial last-minute tip will weigh heavily in her favor. Reeves folded like a cheap suit. He was passing information to Deacon about police movements and schedule stuff he picked up from his business contacts. Turns out he had a gambling problem Deacon was exploiting. And Hank Pritchard, well, Deacon had bailed him out of some serious gambling debts too. Years ago had him on a leash for small favors, information-watching routines. Hank thought this was just another slightly dodgy deal about stolen antiques. Never imagined a person was involved until it was too late, and then he was too scared and too compromised. He's devastated, but he'll face justice too. You did good, Frank. Real good. That kid too. He's the real hero here. Frank just nodded, too tired to speak, the weight of the day settling heavily on him. The days slowly softened into weeks. The bleak, biting autumn chill gradually gave way to a pale, tentative winter sun. Raymond Deacon, his meticulous, cruel plans for Bella painstakingly unraveled by state and federal investigators, was sentenced to 30 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. The charges, including kidnapping, aggravated assault, extortion, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Ms. Albright received a suspended sentence, mandatory counseling, and extensive community service. Her palpable terror at Raymond's hands, her eventual crucial cooperation, and the underlying desperate financial desperation that had made her so tragically vulnerable were all considered significant mitigating factors by the court. Mr. Reeves and Hank Pritchard also faced charges, their lives unraveling due to their greed and weakness, though their cooperation earned them lesser sentences than Deacon. The community of Milburn, shaken from its sleepy, complacent slumber by the insidious darkness unveiled so starkly in its very midst, rallied with unexpected fervor. A substantial fund was started for Bella and Ethan. McCabe's Bakery held a weekend-long bake sale that saw lines stretching around the block, raising thousands. The town's long-forgotten kindness, buried for years under layers of quiet, individual struggles and faded bygone glories, began to bloom anew. Fragile at first, but remarkably persistent, nurtured by a shared sense of outrage and a newfound determination. The upcoming winter solstice fair was now being planned with a renewed sense of purpose, a celebration of community resilience, light conquering darkness. Bella and Ethan moved into a small, sunlit apartment near the town park, a world away from the oppressive shadows and cursed legacy of the Blackwood Mill. Frank, a quiet, unassuming constant in their new fragile lives, helped fix a leaky faucet, had some spare parts lying around. He'd mumble gruffly, frequently brought over bags of groceries. Bulk sale down at the wholesaler, he'd brusquely explain, laden with provisions, and often drove Ethan to his weekly counseling sessions when Bella's new part-time job at the Milburn Library, a job Miss Albright had discreetly helped her secure, made it difficult. He never mentioned the war, not once, but he recognized the stark, unforgiving landscape of trauma in the boy's eyes, and he knew from his own hard-won experience that a steady, quiet, unwavering presence was a universal language understood and deeply valued across all manner of battlefields, both past and present. The school, after a pointed, remarkably private conversation between Frank Grady and the principal, a conversation where Frank may or may not have very calmly, very reasonably mentioned certain powerful phrases like fundamental duty of care, potential school board inquiry, and pervasive actionable negligence, instituted a new, surprisingly robust anti-bullying program. Mr. Davies, looking rather sheepish and deeply chastened even offered Ethan a sincere public apology in front of the entire class and remarkably started taking a genuine, active interest in his students' emotional well-being. The cruel whispers about Ethan didn't entirely cease overnight, but now they were invariably tinged with a hesitant, almost grudging awe, not malice. He was the boy who had survived, the quiet boy whose extraordinary courage had helped save his mother. He even started hesitantly joining energetic games of kickball at recess, his laughter, when it came surprisingly bright and infectious. He joined the after-school art club, his sketches now full of color and fantastical creatures, no longer just shadows and chains. He even started making a few tentative friends, boys and girls drawn to his quiet resilience. One crisp, clear afternoon, as the low winter sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the newly frosted grass just days before the revitalized winter solstice fair, Ethan bounded onto the bus after school, no longer shrinking, no longer hunched, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. Bella waved from the curb, her own smile still fragile perhaps, but growing stronger, more authentically joyful each day. He thrust a carefully folded piece of paper into Frank's calloused hand. Unfolding it, Frank saw a drawing vibrant and alive. With cheap, well-loved crayons, a bright, brilliant blue lake shimmering under a huge, golden, smiling sun surrounded by lush, emerald-green trees on its welcoming banks. 3 figures stood happily by the water. A woman with long, dark braided hair, her face serene. A tall man in a bus driver's cap with a kind, unmistakable smile. And a small, jubilant boy standing proudly between them, his arms flung wide in joyous, unrestrained abandon, reaching for the vast, open sky. There were no chains, no menacing shadows, only an abundance of pure, clear light and an overwhelming, palpable sense of freedom and untainted joy. "I made it for you, Mr. Frank." Ethan beamed, his voice clear, confident, and surprisingly strong. "For the bus. So you don't ever forget us. Or the lake. We're going to go there next summer, Mom says. And for the solstice fair too, Mom's helping with a stall." Frank's throat tightened painfully, an unfamiliar, deeply pleasant warmth spreading through his chest, thawing old sorrows. "I'd be honored, son," he said, his voice rougher, more gravelly than usual. "Truly honored." He carefully, reverently pinned the precious drawing above the windshield right beside his worn, trusty compass, and the faded, cherished photo of Sam, the golden retriever, where the winter light would always catch it, a brilliant splash of vibrant, indomitable hope against the worn, familiar interior of bus number 27. As the bus pulled away smoothly from the curb, rolling into the gentle afternoon sun that glinted brightly off the newly fallen sparkling snow, on the colorful drawing fluttered slightly in the warm draft and from the heater. A testament, a promise. Behind the wheel, Frank Grady, the quiet man who had once preferred the comforting anonymity of his daily route, allowed himself a rare, deep, genuine smile. The quiet, unassuming courage of a small, resilient boy. The steadfast, unshowy kindness of an ordinary, decent man. And the unexpected, profound resilience of a scarred, awakened town. All converging stitch by painful healing stitch into something luminous, something precious, something remarkably, undeniably unbreakable, something that looked, felt, and shone remarkably like hope. The old tired clock in the Milburn Transit Depot might still be stubbornly losing time, its lazy, erratic ticking a constant faint reminder of what was, of losses endured, but for Ethan, for Bella, and even for Frank Grady. Time at long last was finally, blessedly, vibrantly starting anew. The upcoming winter solstice fair he thought would be a true celebration this year, a beacon lit against any returning darkness.